All right, hi everybody. You have made it to the Know Your City program. We are talking about the housing strategic plan tonight. I'm gonna just give a few more minutes here for people to trickle in. You may notice that this is set up as a meeting instead of a webinar, so just you can keep your cameras and mics off. And yeah, we'll get started here in a second. All right, well, I'm just gonna get going here. It seems a couple people are trying to join. All right, so my name is Meg Scheel and I'm the Adult Services Librarian at Old Town Library. I'm so excited for everyone to be here. As I said before, you're here for the Know Your City program with the, I keep forgetting for some reason for the housing, I keep wanting to call it affordable housing, but it's a housing strategic plan. And joining us tonight from the city of Fort Collins is Sue Beck Ferris and Megan Overton. I will let them introduce themselves here in a minute with their positions in the city and the work they do. And they're gonna have a real nice presentation for us and an opportunity to talk or ask questions. You can ask questions throughout if you want to, if you need quick clarity, but maybe the bigger questions we'll save towards the end of the program. Because this is a meeting, you can unmute yourself to ask your question at the end, but you're also totally able to throw your question into the chat and I can read it for you. All right. This is also being recorded and we will post this on the library's YouTube channel in a couple days from now. So it'll be available there if you want to kind of come back to it to recheck. And so, yeah, I just want to thank everyone. This is the final program in a 9-program series that we've done with the city of Fort Collins for the Know Your City programs. And we've worked with several different departments, neighborhood services, natural areas, connection, different departments within neighborhood services, restorative justice and conflict resolution. And it's all just been so great. And most of those presentations are posted on the library's YouTube channel. So feel free to take a look. But yeah, I'm going to hand it over to Sue and to Megan. Thank you.
Thanks, Meg. Before I get started, I keep trying to admit another person and it just isn't happening. So.
I know the Dara. Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Same happening here. I'll try to manage it while you're on your presentation side.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having us here tonight. My name is Sue Beck Ferris. I'm the Social Policy and Housing Programs Manager for the City of Fort Collins. Presenting with me tonight is Megan Overton, our city's housing manager. So we have a little crowd here today, which is great. So feel free to keep this pretty informal, ask us questions. If we don't get through the whole presentation, that's okay. We did provide a lot of information for you because when we talk about housing, which is the topic tonight, we really like to ground the conversation in information about who lives here today and who is likely to live here tomorrow, because that's really who we like to keep in mind while we're doing this policy work. Next slide, please. So as Meg mentioned, we recently passed a new housing strategic plan. This is different than the housing plans of the past because it takes a look at the entire spectrum from homelessness to any kind of home that you might like, a luxury home. In the past, we really focused our policy on affordable housing, the kind of housing that needs subsidy or policy to be built because the market can't do it on its own. It used to be that the real estate market provided lots of choices And that is getting less and less true. So the key outcomes that we hope for with this plan is to increase housing supply and affordability, increase housing choice, increase accessibility, preserve our existing affordable housing, improve housing equity, and increase stability, because so many of our residents are renters, and just renting is less stable, generally speaking, than homeownership. Next slide, Megan. Our vision is that everyone has a healthy, stable housing they can afford. Healthy meaning, it really is free of mold and is a comfortable place to live. Again, stability for so many renters and residents who are renters in our community. And then affordability, which is becoming more and more difficult. More than 60% of our rental households are cost burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on housing, and it makes it hard to have enough money for all the other needs when you spend that much on housing. Next slide. This is kind of just a broad overview of what we talk about, what we mean when we say the entire housing spectrum. Up to 80% area median income is where we have affordable housing. And that's the area that we have had a history of programs, policies, and subsidies to really help that end of the spectrum. In the middle, the market used to take care of this, not so much anymore. It's becoming more difficult, and we're looking at how can we help with policy influence that part of the market. And then, of course, there's housing that goes as expensive as you can imagine. Next. So we do a lot at the city, but we don't do everything. So yes, the area median income is per household. I'm answering the question in the chat. And we can use lots of different ways to look at the area median income. We can use the HUD figures that go by household size. We can use the exact point where half the incomes are less and half the incomes are more, or we can use the family half more and half less. So it is something that you might see different numbers for. We're not always using the same source for that. So the city, again, we do a lot of work on policy and guide principles. We do funding. We are our own utility for the most part. We do have some water districts and other things in our city. We fund all those things with city fees, and we regulate development. We do programs and partnerships in education with partners. So that's a crossover area. But we rely on partners to actually do the developing, do the building, and provide the housing. Next. We thought these might be interesting questions to keep in mind as we go through the next set of demographic information and trends. These are just some reflection questions. If you currently own your own home, could you purchase it today based on your income? Meg was talking about this before we opened the Zoom call. Can the young people in your life live here? Do you see yourself retiring here and aging in community? Can you afford to downsize if you wish to? Are there options for you? And then what resonated with you most based on the information that we're sharing? Did anything surprise you? So those are just some things to keep in mind as we go through our information. I had a prettier version of this slide, so I apologize, but basically the headline, does tell it all. Median home prices have doubled in 10 years. They were about 223 in 2012, and they're about 443 by the time we get to 2021. Median home sales of existing homes have gone up 17.8% nationwide. And last quarter, 1 out of 6 homes was bought by an investor. Cash sales are becoming much more popular these days, much more common, and that makes it really hard for first-time home buyers to compete with a cash offer. So those are just some kind of characteristics of our current homeownership supply. Next slide, please. And then rents have been climbing too. Between 2012 and 2021, they pretty much doubled. 60% of renters pay more than 30% of their income on rent. So that's really significant for people. And when you look at how starting in 2012, before that, it was pretty stable. Rents were pretty stable for a while, but starting in 2012, things have just continued to climb and climb. Next slide. How about incomes? Are they keeping pace? Not on a community-wide level. So really, when you look at this, you know, we are seeing this dynamic actually force people out of our community. We lost about 3,000 renters that made under 25,000 in the last several years, and gained about 4,000 that made more than 75,000. So people that don't make a lot of money, people that live here and work here and have for a long time, have really tough choices. And people that want to move from rental to ownership, it's very, very difficult. There's very few things in the market that renters can afford, and you have to earn at least 75,000 before you can even think about it. Next slide. The next couple of slides show a little more information about income. And what I thought was interesting, this is a little fuzzy, but the third bar in shows you it takes about $59,000 to rent a 2-bedroom apartment comfortably in our community. So even 2 waiters together could not afford a typical 2-bedroom in current market conditions. Next slide. This slide shows 4 categories of employment that represent about 35% of all of the jobs in our community. Things like healthcare workers, food prep, teachers, office support. All of these income categories would qualify for affordable housing in our community. None of those jobs could support a family on their own, a 2-bedroom apartment on their own. Okay, now I'm going to give it over to Megan, our housing manager, and she's going to take you through the next set of slides.
Awesome, thanks, Sue. So Sue talked a little bit about what's been happening in our housing market, and I'll spend just a few minutes talking about the community itself and how Fort Collins has grown and changed over time. And we can talk about this in the Q&A. I'm curious if these look like current headlines to anybody. Fort Collins has been growing and growing quickly for decades. These are headlines from 1996 and 1997 when we were doing a big city comprehensive plan. And at that time, Fort Collins was growing at a rapid pace. That's continued from at least the 1980s to the present day. You can see this kind of in numbers if you're more of a numbers person on this slide. So at the top here is our current population and our current total number of housing units in the entire community. And you can see the kind of percentage growth over time. So as the community gets bigger, we're still adding between 2,000 and 3,000 people every year, but as a proportion of our total population, that rate of growth is actually slowing down a little bit. And our housing capacity as well has started to slow slightly over the last 20 years when you look at the overall capacity of housing in the community. So as I mentioned, the rate of growth is slowing. As we move further into the future, you can see this kind of little inflection point circled here on the graph, and that's in somewhere around 2030. Population projections are part science and part art, but we expect that we'll start to see 2,000 to 2,500 new residents annually, so just a little bit slower than we have been seeing over the last 40 or so years. And some folks may be aware of this, but others might not know that Fort Collins actually has what we call a growth management area around the community. And that's a line beyond which Fort Collins has decided we will not expand and grow. So that really limits the amount of land Fort Collins has to grow outward over time. So if our population continues to go up, then we have to be making some different choices about how we're using the limited amount of land that we have left. We know that even as that rate of growth is slowing a little bit though, Fort Collins is likely to run out of capacity for housing. This slide here shows our last forecast for housing that we did during the city's comprehensive plan a couple of years ago. And we expect that the demand for housing in Fort Collins will exceed our capacity by about 2,000 homes by 2040. So we need to start thinking about how to increase that capacity to keep up with the population that we expect to have in the community. And then on the right, our current housing mix. Some folks are curious about, what does housing look like in Fort Collins and how does it compare to the nation? So you can see here that Fort Collins is predominantly made up of single unit detached houses with some attached units. Those are like townhome style. That's what I live in, disclosure. And then multifamily buildings that have more than 5 units and then make up the other big chunk of housing stock in Fort Collins. There is a small percentage of other housing as well that would mostly include manufactured home communities. Compared to the rest of the nation, we have slightly more multifamily housing than some other communities. That's primarily likely a function of having a large university in our community. And we have fewer smaller scale attached and other kinds of options when you compare Fort Collins to the nation as a whole. And this is just, I was curious one day, and some of the planners were too, of when different housing was built in our community. So this is how Fort Collins housing stock breaks down by when it was built by decade. So it starts in 1939, and you can see that we've built most of our housing after 1970, which makes sense if you think about when the community grew at its fastest rates. And we've built over half of our housing since 1990. So that's a little bit about housing capacity and housing growth and population, but our demographics are also shifting in our community. Like many communities in the country, Fort Collins is aging. I think the graph on the left is really interesting to me. In 1960, you can see you've got a lot of children under the age of 18, and then another kind of larger group of people in those like middle age ranges. When you look out to 2060, that kind of dynamic of population really levels out. We've got about as many people from the ages of 0 to 4 as we have from 65 to 69 years old. So that has some implications for what kinds of housing we need, how much housing we need, and what kinds of types of housing people might be interested in living in. And then when you break this down to a neighborhood level, in Fort Collins, we're pretty evenly split with the percentage of households who have children under the age of 18, who have an individual over 60 in their home, and the number of people who live alone. When you think about the fact that Fort Collins has mostly single unit detached kind of multiple bedroom houses, this is really interesting to think about what it could mean for the kinds of housing our community will need as these kinds of demographics continue to shift. We're also seeing different kinds of development. Folks who have lived here for a while might have noticed that our apartment projects are starting to look a little bit different. There's more redevelopment happening in the kind of parts of the community that are already built up. We're seeing more rent by the bedroom or student housing. And we're starting to see taller buildings as well that might have parking integrated into the building instead of next to the building or behind the building. And I think this is where I hand it over to Sue, but I also see that I have some questions. Let's see, tiny house zoning. So this is a great question, and it's one that comes up anytime we start talking about the different kinds of housing people are interested in, because we'll talk a little bit about this later too, that the city's rules and regulations about housing were written in most cases a long time ago when tiny homes or a cluster of cottages together or co-housing weren't really things that we were thinking about at the time. So we're in the process right now of trying to rewrite or adjust the land use regulations in Fort Collins. Right now, we don't have a minimum house size, so you could build a very small home or a tiny home. The challenge with that becomes when it's mobile on wheels, and we run into some issues with the building code as well. So I would say, yes, it's a possibility, but there are some barriers right now to building tiny homes the way that most folks think about putting a tiny home on wheels and finding a piece of land or a piece of land they own and putting a house on it. So those are some of the things that we need to untangle. All right, Sue, go ahead.
So just like people have cycles of life, neighborhoods have cycles of life. And people that have been here a long time will know that Old Town is now one of the most popular places to live. And that wasn't always true in the life cycle of that particular neighborhood. And one thing, I guess we skipped a slide that I saw in an earlier deck that showed not only are we building more, have we built so many more houses after 1990, but the size of the average house continues to get bigger and bigger. Our household size gets smaller, but our housing sizes are not getting smaller. So what does that mean for today and tomorrow, right? Our household composition is getting smaller for sure. We're not seeing big families in these single units these days. We're aging as homeowners, and yet there aren't a lot of places for us to move to, and a lot of people don't want to move. They want to stay in their house where they raise their family. 82% of Larimer County homeowners over age 65 have 2 empty bedrooms in their home. And sometimes regulations make it difficult to respond to changes in the neighborhood conditions or in neighborhood context. You know, building lots in the biggest building lots are usually in the most restricted residential zones. So the biggest lots you can do the least with. Very often you couldn't add an accessory dwelling unit or convert a house into a duplex in the places that have the biggest lots. More people are working from home. We're all working from home tonight. But home occupations work best for certain things that aren't customer facing, right? That's going to be kind of a problem for your neighbors. So we're trying to figure out, how do we take this inflexible housing stock and make it respond to the life that we're living? Next slide. Policy changes over time as well. Homeownership used to be pretty much everybody's dream, and it's not anymore. Nationally and locally, people are renting for longer or for their whole lives. Is that a preference, or is that because they can't attain homeownership? Probably both. Colorado's in sort of an evolution on renters' rights, which is a long time coming. We have always been in the bottom of the United States in terms of renter rights. It's that, leftover homestead mentality, maybe, I don't know. But the legislature has been really busy changing that. And manufactured housing communities built on the fringes of town, sort of assuming they would be temporary. There's a lot of redevelopment pressure now as cities have grown around, and these are really great sites now. They're not necessarily on the edge of town. And we need to really think about what happens when they redevelop. And we had a lot of policy around that in the city of Fort Collins. Mitigation for displacement, help for people, but that has sort of shifted now. And we're recognizing that this is a housing type that's really important for a lot of people. And instead of trying to mitigate redevelopment impacts, we're preserving those parks into the future as places for people to live. Next slide. Okay, what will the future bring? Well, we're not sure because we don't have a crystal ball, but we are looking at trends and knowing that there are certain neighborhoods that could be subject to gentrification in a way that could displace people, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen. So we're looking for what conditions would signal that, and how do we give people strategies to stay if they want to. We really want to make sure that we have good distribution of options throughout our city. Everybody's asking for more diversity of housing types. Both the market and the policy are going to help us get that. For instance, condominiums, there's a big market need for condominiums, and there's been some problems with a state law that basically stopped development of them. We're starting to see that come back. The market is pushing that. And we're trying to fix the legal problems. Also, things like metropolitan districts require public benefits, and that can bring new housing choice to our community as we build out. Next slide. So, there's going to be more and more infill in our community, less greenfield development. What's left are harder sites to develop. We may have to start looking at adaptive reuse or redevelopment opportunities. And one of the best opportunities for vacant land within our community are the backyards of churches and faith-based institutions. There's a lot of vacant land that is in the control of faith-based institutions. And we're now seeing churches either sell it off to develop or develop in a way that's mission aligned. Like, for instance, one church gave a lot to Habitat for Humanity right there on their property. And now someone can live there. Next slide. There's a lot more interest in co-living options. Again, is this preference or necessity? Not sure. But multi-generational households are forming, non-traditional households, co-housing and micro units. I really like this little graphic because it shows you all the many ways that a second unit could be added to a single unit home and not really change the amount of room it's taking very much. So co-housing is more popular for aging parents, adult children. Seniors are replacing, maybe replacing students in some of the buy by the room, rent by the room kind of opportunities that are out there. And, we are seeing a lot more interest in these extra units. New developments are including them, like Revive and Rigdon Farms, and some other ones that are going through the development process now. That seems to be pretty acceptable to people, but we also think this could be an opportunity for existing neighborhoods to gently add more units and allow for more housing. Next slide. This is just an example of a micro unit. Could be as small as 400 square feet, but it has everything you need. And for instance, Denver has a couple of apartment buildings that are only micro units, and then they have large common areas for people to enjoy. Next slide. This is just an example of a co-op that is built from the inception as a community-oriented option. It has community buildings for common meals and stuff. And you can see here that all the decks or porches face the central area, and that's very intentional. Next slide. So just to summarize a little bit, while more people are living alone and our households are getting smaller, our unit sizes are getting bigger. And student-focused multifamily units are our biggest units and may not be that desirable for the families. We're aging in place and we're having a lot more multi-generational living. And this is where sometimes our regulations make it a little bit inflexible to really change the way our house is structured and how we use it. And then, income is just not keeping up with housing costs, and it's causing a lot of concern for people who are trying to enter homeownership. All right, Megan, back to you.
Okay, so Sue and I, in our previous kind of sections of this presentation, have gone through demographic changes and population changes, housing stock changes. So all of this change and the potential future impacts of that change is where we started when we began working on the housing strategic plan that Sue talked about at the very beginning. That plan was adopted in March of 2021. And while we were working on that plan, we did a lot of community engagement, talking to folks about their experiences with housing in Fort Collins and what kinds of challenges they saw to achieving healthy, stable housing people can afford. I won't read all of the challenges on the slide, but anyone who has tried to find a house or an apartment to rent or purchase has probably lived through several of these challenges. We know that prices are rising for everyone to try to afford housing, and that those rising costs are disproportionately impacting our Black, Indigenous, people of color communities and our low-income communities more than the population as a whole. And we know that we don't have enough funding for housing. And we know that housing is expensive to build and is likely going to continue to rise in the cost it takes to build a home or an apartment as we go out into the future. Resources are not unlimited. Things like water and lumber and labor continue to get more expensive over time. So these are just some of the challenges we know we're facing. And what we did with the housing strategic plan was identify 26 different strategies that could help us start to address some of these challenges. The city has a role to play in housing, but we can't control everything about it. So we really tried to focus in the plan on those things that the city could have a positive impact on, or the things that the city does control, like land use regulations. The city does have an affordable housing goal, and that's to get to the point where 10% of our housing is deed restricted to people making 80% of area median income or below by 2040. This slide shows you how we're doing. We've basically maintained at about 5% since 2015. We wanted to be a little bit further ahead than we are now, and to get to that 10% goal, we recalculated our numbers when we did the housing strategic plan. And essentially, we need to more than double the city's production of affordable housing every single year between now and 2040 to get there. So that means everybody has a role to play in getting to that number. The city doesn't build housing. We support the building of housing, and then we need to rely on our partners, on neighbors, on residents to really help us get there. And so the 26 strategies I talked about, that's my primary role at the city, is kind of shepherding the implementation of this housing plan and trying to make sure that we're moving as many of those strategies forward as possible. We're approaching the housing strategic plan on a 2-year implementation cycle, which basically means that we know things change fast. And we know that we don't have all of the ideas we're going to have right now, that something else might come up, conditions might change, and we'll want to reevaluate which are our top priorities and how we're planning to move forward. So I'll talk a little bit about the things we're working on right now for this 2-year cycle. And then I think we'll probably wrap up and we can answer any questions you all have. So one of the things that we're about to finish pretty soon here is an equity and opportunity assessment. And this is basically what Sue was talking about earlier, that we know anecdotally that there are some parts of our community that are experiencing a lot of pressure around redevelopment, that people may not be able to continue living in their neighborhoods as demographics change and as housing prices rise. So we want to know a lot more about that and put some data around it. So that's what the equity and opportunity assessment is trying to help us do. And we should be wrapping that up, I would say, within the next month. This project is going to take a little bit longer. This is the land use code changes I was talking about earlier. We're seeking to have those completed probably by the spring of 2022 for housing. There may be a second phase of land use code changes to address commercial and industrial and some of the other updates we know we need to make. But essentially, the land use code, the regulations we have around development, those were written in 1997, and we've updated pieces of that code regularly over the last 20 years, but we haven't really looked at it comprehensively. So that's what we're doing here, and really trying to address that housing supply and housing capacity issue, as well as look at the incentives we provide for affordable housing to make sure they're working the way that we intend them to. We're also looking at occupancy and rental programming. We talked a little earlier about the importance of housing stability and having healthy housing. And this is something that we had a council work session on recently, looking at the possibility of a rental licensing or registration program, which Fort Collins currently does not have. So the intent here would be to address that housing stability and healthy housing, particularly for the 40+% of our population who rent their homes. And then mostly things tend to come down to money. We know that we don't have enough funding for housing. We spend, the city spends somewhere between $2 and $3 million a year invested in affordable housing. And it's simply not enough, particularly as the cost to develop housing continues to rise. So this is a conversation we need to have with city council and alongside conversations about revenue needs for things like transit and parks as well. So this is something that hasn't quite gotten underway yet, but we're looking forward to that conversation as well. This is what the next 6 months looks like for housing. It's busy work for Sue and I and a whole team of people across the city who are plugging in on different pieces of this. But those few big projects I mentioned are where our focus is in the policy world right now, on top of all of the other things that we do every day, working with our affordable housing providers and evaluating requests for funding and a whole host of other kind of regular maintenance work we do around affordable housing. And then if you wanted to get involved in anything, you certainly can, and we would welcome that. There is a website, it's www.fcgov.com/housing. We're trying to make sure that the big projects that we're working on, you can get to that housing page and link to some of the work we're doing for that housing plan implementation. We also recently did a series of information sessions for the land use code changes. So if that's something that sounds interesting to you, we've recorded all of those and you can watch those at your leisure. We also have a newsletter you can sign up for at the website as well. So with that, I'll bring you back to the reflection questions, and we would love to talk more with you, answer any questions you have, hear your stories, and really appreciate the time you took tonight to learn about what we do in the city and affordable housing. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I can't believe how much work you all do to understand the housing in Fort Collins and the development, and anticipating it. So I do have a question that came through from Charlotte. What are the regulations that prevent new ADUs and other alternative ways to add density to existing neighborhoods?
Charlotte, there are so many. So the city regulates development through that land use code And one of the biggest ways that we currently restrict where you can put an accessory dwelling unit is just by saying that the only residential use allowed somewhere is a single family home. There are lots of parts of our community where that's the case. So you wouldn't be allowed to add another unit because then it wouldn't be a single family home anymore. In areas where you can add an additional unit, there are lots of different regulations for how far back it needs to be set from another home, how many parking spaces there are, how the utility connections work. So it can, if you can build an accessory dwelling unit, it might be not really economically feasible once you add up all the costs of it. So that's a whole other piece that's maybe not land use regulations, but that's another problem to tackle as well. So with the land use code, I think we're hoping that we can permit those accessory units in more places in the community and then start tackling those other barriers, whether they're utilities or something else that's not directly regulated by the land use code.
Awesome, thanks. So then there's kind of a comment here, and it does make me curious. Having a limit of rentals would be so helpful. Our neighborhood, Harvest Park, is about 40% rentals. And then thanks for the work you guys are doing. Yeah, so that makes me, go ahead, Sue.
Sorry, I jumped right in.
Okay.
What we know about the rentals in our community is a lot less than what we need to know. We have not had a really good way to work with landlords, getting information. For short-term rentals, yeah, we know where they are and who's providing them, and we even do inspections, but we really have not had a big history of rental registration or anything. So I think when we learn more about the rentals in our community, that's when we'll know how to best bring regulation to them. I don't know that a limit is ever going to be, you know, a precise number like that, but it does matter. The ratio of homeowners to renters can affect mortgages and other things. So finding more information about that will really help us be smarter with our policies.
Thanks, Sue. What percentage of the city is single family zoning?
And is another really good question. I'm trying to find the exact number here because I don't want to misspeak, but I don't have it immediately handy. You give me just a minute. Maybe we can skip that one and Sue can take the next question. I know I have it. I just need to Google it in my email here.
Great. Yeah, so the next question is, can you give more information on the potential of a stationary, not on wheels, tiny home area for Fort Collins?
So, you know, like Megan said, the codes really didn't have tiny homes in mind, but they did have mobile home parks and other living situations with very small lots. So I think that as we learn more about what can go into mobile home parks, there may be an opportunity for tiny homes. The thing about tiny homes is they're not standardized. And so even mobile home parks are like, they have HUD standards and make it easy to put a unit in, take a unit out, and have it be kind of plug and play. So I think we're still learning a lot about tiny homes. As Megan said, we don't have a minimum house size. So you could build a tiny home, but so many of the fees would be the same as a big home. And so again, it becomes really cost prohibitive. The other thing about tiny homes is the early research on tiny homes shows that most people don't enjoy living in them long term. It seems like it works for some people, but not for most people. And a tiny home can be half the size of a mobile home. So they can be really, really small, and they can be really well designed. So we're learning about where that might fit into both land use codes, to our community, and actually to our culture. I think that all has to kind of be sorted out before we get too busy building tiny homes. There are a lot of tiny homes in the country, that tiny home communities for people exiting homelessness, and they're kind of built as a temporary solution, and they're very successful in that way as transitional housing. But again, it hasn't really been a long-term play for most people.
Thanks. Megan, do you want us to come back to you, or?
I can tackle Charlotte's other question while I'm still looking for the actual number. I should just estimate, because I would be close, but I definitely don't want to misspeak. So Charlotte, I think that's one of the big considerations for the land use code changes that are going on right now, where we currently don't allow anything other than a single family detached home. Where is it appropriate to think about allowing things like duplexes or accessory dwelling units? And what do those need to look like to fit in with their existing context too? So those are big questions to answer, but that's something that we're hoping to tackle with those code updates as well. Yeah, Sue.
And I'll just jump in there. Some states are doing this at the state level, and that's been sort of helps the cities along. Like, for instance, California says ADUs are legal. Everywhere you can have an accessory dwelling unit. And so the local jurisdiction then isn't having to answer the what, it answers the how, and figures out how that's going to work for their community. And places like Oregon have said no single family home zones anymore. So when that happens at the state level, it puts pressure actually on localities to really tackle these difficult, politically charged capacity issues.
Thanks. So I think, Sue, you used a term that I wasn't familiar with, Metropolitan Districts. And do we have those in Fort Collins, or what are they?
They are special taxing districts that help developers amortize certain costs over time so that they don't have to pay them all up front. And they're taxing districts that the people that live only in that area pay. And so we do have some communities in our town being developed with metropolitan districts, and certainly in Colorado, it's a very common way to get pretty big developments financed.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, some success. I have to report back to you all. That took way longer than I wanted, but so the way I'll answer this is just by saying this is not a complete number, because Fort Collins has 27 different zone districts, and each of them allow different kinds of things. So what the information that I'm giving you is for one zone district. It's called the low density residential, or RL zone. And it's one of the, it covers some of the largest area of Fort Collins, and it doesn't allow anything that's not a single family home. So this is a really good kind of estimate. There are a couple of other smaller zone districts that are also pretty limited in what they allow, but I don't have them all added up in one place, unfortunately. I should do that after this meeting. But the RL zone that does not allow anything other than a single family home represents 24% of the land area of Fort Collins, is in that zone district. And there's also a lot of Fort Collins that's made up of natural areas or agricultural land as well. So actually there's on one of the slides that we had for tonight, I didn't make this point at the time. But if it's okay, I'll share this again and just kind of highlight here. Okay, so so the RL zone is about 24% of Fort Collins land area. But when you look here, these three categories here are low density residential, which is less than like 3 dwelling units per acre. It's pretty low density. This here is agricultural land, and this is parks, natural areas, and open space. So all combined, that's a lot of Fort Collins land that is being used in those particular ways right now. Some of the places where you'd see higher densities or apartments and things like that in this medium and high density residential are a pretty small slice of the way Fort Collins land area is being used. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I know it's a more complicated answer than you might have been hoping for.
That was great. That was so helpful. I didn't realize how much was already kind of zoned out by those 3 bigger chunks there. That's really interesting.
Yeah, something else that we've tended to talk about a lot recently is I think it's really easy to focus on new development and the things that we haven't built yet. But the vast majority of the housing that Fort Collins is going to have, we've already built. We have, 70 or 80,000 housing units in Fort Collins. So talking about what to do with those as well as what we do with stuff we haven't built yet we need to talk about both of those things.
All right, I see just maybe a couple more questions. I've heard that in California, parking requirements and lot sizes still hold back ADU and other non-single family home developments.
These are controversial things. People feel really strongly about their existing neighborhoods, and some people just don't want anything to change. And for those people, they're going to find ways to try to, get around even a statewide law that says we're going to allow ADUs. But a lot of other communities are going to embrace that state law, and they're going to make it much more available, and the market will kind of send people to the right flavor, I think. But we do try to, do regulations without loopholes where we can. And when we learn about ways to get around it, we can change our regulation so that we can really try to make it as fair as possible for people.
Thanks. I think that helps answer that question below. What can we do to make sure that ADUs and other types of density are not restricted? So I think you spoke to that. Do you know of any groups working to push the city to get denser?
I don't know if there's a organized group. I know that these conversations about what should Fort Collins look like in the future and where should we add different kinds of housing, that's the big conversation right now. And there are a wide range of opinions from, we should just add as much housing as we can to we don't need to change anything, and everything in between. I think one of the best ways to kind of stay in the loop about those things and start to kind of see what's going on. If you live in a neighborhood and you get a letter for a neighborhood meeting about a housing project that's being proposed near you, go check it out, see what you think, participate in that, and share your opinions there about things as they're being proposed to be built. And then I would encourage you to sign up for the newsletter on the housing page too. We try to send out updates about every month, just about what's going on and what we're working on, when we're going to city council, what kinds of workshops and things are coming up. So that's a good way to stay in the loop about what the big issues are currently. And we try to keep folks informed about that.
And there are grassroots groups that form. For instance, in Boulder, they have a YIMBY group, Yes in My Backyard. We don't have a satellite yet here that I'm aware of, but I know that there are people that are becoming more and more vocal in saying we want our community to grow with the population, and we want to be proactive here. So getting educated is the first step. So coming to, library presentations like this, city presentations, the chamber, DDA, everybody is offering a lot of educational opportunities. And that might be the best way to find out where you fit in and where your particular voice might be added.
Thanks. And I'm just going to make a little plug because in the month previous to, so in October, the Know Your City, we did talk about restorative justice and conflict resolution, but also Alyssa Stevens presented about neighborhood services, and she's a neighborhood development liaison. So she spoke a lot to sort of those neighborhood meetings and the development meetings that people have. And so that was really informative. And the month prior to that, Ginny Sawyer presented on the city managers, and it was kind of a state of the city presentation, and it touched on a lot of things that you guys have been really detailed about, which is development and projections. And so it's really kind of cool to see this get more details from you all with the housing.
And I think it can be hard to know, like, you talk about the housing plan and the vision and like, okay, the housing plan's done. So what can I do and how can I have an impact in my neighborhood? And just having a sense of what's being proposed near you and getting plugged into what's happening is probably the best way to do that.
Plus, a lot of times people only show up if they have a problem with a development, not if they support it. So we don't always get, an even representation. Most people are like, I'm for it. I don't have to go. Well, no, you don't, but you still could, and you could learn, and you could actually probably contribute and make it a better development at the end of the day. So they sound it, you get that little card in the mail, and you're like, why would I go to this? But I think it's worth going at least to a few, and then you might get hooked.
I feel that way about city hall meetings there. Once you go, you're like, that's fun. I learned so much. So yeah. Civic engagement, right? So that's, yeah, thanks to everyone who came tonight. So I think it looks like we're kind of wrapping up here. We're right at 8 o'clock, and the questions have fizzled. But everyone says thank you here in the chat. And I just want to extend my thanks to Sue and Megan for the information tonight. Very, very informative. And feel free to reach out to me. And I'm going to say this on your behalf because all city employees are just so helpful. I'm sure you can reach out to Sue or Megan if you have more questions, or anyone in the social sustainability department with Fort Collins. And with that, I'm gonna go ahead and say goodnight to all y'all, and thanks so much for coming out. All right, bye.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Thanks.